From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Chris Murphy. I'm the head of the Near East section, and today I'm also acting chief of the African Middle Eastern division because our chief, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, is on holiday in India. I want to welcome you all here this afternoon to one of a series of lectures that will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the African section at the Library of Congress. The African section is one of the three sections in the African Middle Eastern division, and it is where the specialists who are charged with the developing of the collection concerning sub-Saharan Africa, this is where they work, and in their 50 years they have overseen the development of a tremendous collection. As with many of the Library of Congress collections, the Africana collection here at the Library of Congress is one of the best, if not the best, in the United States. And that's totally due to the dedication of the staff members there. And with that, I again say welcome to you all, and it's very pleasing to me, who have been here 25 years, so half the time that the African section has existed, to see that they are having these lectures to take cognizance of 50 years of tremendous work. Thank you. Laverne?
I'm so pleased to see you here at our program. Again, my name is Laverne Page. I'm an area specialist in the African section of the African and Middle Eastern Division, and I have three colleagues, Angel Batiste, Eve Ferguson, and Marita Harper. This year, the African section is celebrating its 50th anniversary. In 1960, the section was established due to funding from the Carnegie Corporation and major lobbying activities from Africanists, especially influential members of the African Studies Association and a very special unit of the African Studies Association, the Archives Libraries Committee, which is now called the Africana Librarians Council. It was only later that the African section was supported by funding from Congress. So 1960, it was a pivotal year. On the African continent, 17 countries gained independence, and the library recognized the need for a specialized reference unit for sub-Saharan Africa to advise and participate in the library's acquisitions efforts, and to provide reference and bibliographic services, and to maintain liaison with other institutions in the United States and abroad that were concerned with Africa, with African studies. Information on the first 10 years of the African section is captured quite well in this publication, the Quarterly Journal of the Library of Congress. It was published in July, this issue in July of 1970. And it's a beautiful, beautiful publication, and we hope that it will be reissued or at least digitized and put on the library's website. We're honored to have a book talk today that takes us back to this pivotal year, 1960, due to activists like Cora Weiss. Waves of African students received opportunities to pursue higher education, and thankfully, she saved the papers, the documents, the records of the African American Student Foundation. Due to researchers like Tom Schachman, we get to read about this period in history, about the airlifts. To tell you something about our speakers today, the last time I tried to introduce Mrs. Cora Weiss, who is the former executive director of the African American Student Foundation. I had so much to say that everything converged and I was speechless. So I will just say she connects people, she connects ideas, and I think that she's a terrific lady. She's an activist, and I think she can introduce herself better than I could ever hope to do so, so I will leave that. Tom, Mr. Tom Schachman, has an extensive biography. He's a filmmaker, educator, and author of more than 30 nonfiction books, and 2 more being published this year. He's produced and directed documentaries for major television networks such as ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS, and there is so much more to say about Tom, but his activities are listed on his website, www.tomschachman.com, and you could learn so much more about him there. So I will now ask Cora Weiss to come to the podium and to speak. Thank you.
Well, happy anniversary, Library of Congress, or Africa Division. It's your 50th, and it's the 50th plus of the African American Student Foundation. So we share anniversaries, and I'm here because we never threw anything away, which makes me adored by historians and not adored by everyone else. So for 50 years, we've kept papers about the African American Student Foundation and the Airlift in our garage, and thanks to that, Tom Schachman has written a very, very good book about the history of the Airlift. The Airlift's purpose and being and experience melds perfectly with February history, Black History Month, and March, Women's History Month. And I'll explain that as we move along. And the connection between the Airlift and the Africa section of the library is that Laverne, it's okay for me to get personal, Laverne's husband's brother-in-law, if you can figure that out, was a student from East Africa at Adelphi University, and he came on the Airlift. So we've got more in common than conflict. I want to point out some highlights that represent a kind of quick thumbnail sketch of what the Airlift represented. The Airlift was a visionary, and I will now say revolutionary, idea of Tom Mboya, who was the labor and liberation leader of Kenya. He had that idea in 1958, and in 1959, the first of a number of chartered airplanes came to this country with students from East Africa, first from Kenya mostly, and then from Kenya, what was then Tanganyika, Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and so forth, the East African strip, to go to mostly colleges and universities and some to high schools. In a few words, the Airlift became a political football in the Kennedy election, a small glacier in the Cold War, a tug of war with client states, with the UK, London calling Washington to say, keep your hands off our turf, a wedge that opened the door of Southern white Christian, mostly Christian colleges to American blacks because they would take African students, not because they were black, but because they were foreign. But they wouldn't take American blacks. And with the help of the civil rights movement, those schools began to open their doors. It was a huge influence on changing the way we deal with foreign student enrollment in this country. Until then, foreign students came on a very elite basis. If you were the son or daughter of a king or a prince or somebody VIP somewhere, you could get into an American college. And I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember whether there were foreign students on your campuses when you went to school in the 50s. There were a few Africans at mine in Wisconsin. but basically it was not a major item in American education to have foreign students here, and with the airlift, it began to open the door to much bigger foreign student enrollment. The majority of the students who came on the airlift went home to become nation builders, and the majority of other foreign students who have come to this country sometimes stay here. And they went home to become nation builders for very good reason. Tom Mboya's comment about why he did this, he said, "My efforts to help African students to study overseas is based on my conviction that our people need higher education, and that as a leader, it's my task and responsibility to help. These are men and women who will help build our nation." And I emphasize women because that was not something in the 50s that most male leaders would mention or talk about, and we did have an extraordinary percentage of women students on the airlift, which I recognize now was part of that revolution. We persuaded President Kennedy to convene a conference on education for African freedom, and basically the whole airlift became a vehicle for creating nation builders. Aside from Tom Mboya, there were other Kenyan leaders. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that history, but Kiano and Njiri, Koinange, and later we persuaded a coalition called PAFMECA, which is the Pan-African Freedom Movement for East and Central Africa, and which included Nyerere and Joshua Nkomo, and do these names ring any bells for any of you? And Kenneth Kaunda, the liberation leaders from the other countries, and they eventually became part of the supporters of the airlift, and it broadened the geographic base for the students who came here. I think the most important thing to say from this side of the lake, from the American side, is that those of us who came together to help on this loved the students. We knocked ourselves out for them. We found jobs, we found homes, we found doctors, we found lawyers. We found things that they needed and that we thought would be helpful to give them a more comfortable and meaningful stay in this country. And I say that's important because I'm not sure that that quality is necessarily in place with some of the other more established foreign student organizations. Secondly, we were risk takers. The whole thing was a risk-taking operation. I mean, who would send 81 students on a plane to a country that no one knew very much about? I mean, until then, under colonialism, the road went to London. And then under the Cold War, the road went either to London or to Moscow in a tug of war. And Bill Scheinman, who started this whole thing, who was an entrepreneur, was the biggest risk taker of all, pouring thousands of his own dollars into this until we came along and started a major fundraising campaign. The other major thing, and there are many major things equally major, is that this was run by, designed by, and carried out by Africans from Africa. They vetted the students, they selected the students, they sent the students, and the American side was made up of African Americans, Africans, and I was the white woman. And we implemented the vision, helped to implement the vision that the African leaders wanted to see happen so that they could have people in place when the Brits would leave in '63 upon Uhuru, freedom, and they were going to take all the civil servants away with them and leave. Somebody once said they even took the light bulbs. But they left the management of the country basically bare. And there were not sufficient numbers of educated Africans to take over because East Africa had no university. Makerere was just a technical school. And many of the high schools, secondary schools, were private missionary schools, which meant that it was for kids who had some money. So basically, the educational system didn't support the creation of a group of people who could run the country. Most of us were of the same generation. I did a birth chart here, which I think was also rather important in all of this. We were pretty much the same age. I was the youngest by only 4 years. Jack Kennedy, who then became president, was the oldest by 10 years. But everyone else, Tom Mboya, Martin Luther King, Harry Belafonte, Bill Scheinman, were all between 1927 and 1930, born between 1927 and 1930. And that helped, I think, to create a camaraderie among us. It was one of the elements that did, aside from the fact that we just loved each other and worked together and all wanted the same thing. The civil rights movement was at its height in this country. The anti-colonial movement was at its height in Africa. The Cold War was on. There were a number of factors that came together that created the opening for Tom Mboya to come here and say, I'd like to bring students to this country. Will you help me? And that's how it happened. And now it's in a book. The history is in a book. And Tom Shachtman is here to tell you a lot more about it and what he's got in his book that you should buy and read and give to your local libraries. There are only 3 of us alive from the whole operation on this side of the ocean. Ted Keel was in his very late 90s. He was a member of the board of directors. Harry Belafonte and myself. Harry has written the foreword to the book, and Harry and Sidney Poitier and Jackie Robinson played a very important role in fundraising for this whole visionary, it wasn't crazy, it was wonderful operation, but you had to be a little crazy to work with it because no one had ever done anything like this before. And we were pilloried, we were attacked night and day for diluting educational standards by bringing bunches of Africans from the bush to come to our country. Of course, they've become presidents and vice presidents and members of parliament and professors when they went home. But we were attacked because we moved into a field that had a very small, tight establishment. The African American Institute, the Institute for International Education, and something that David Henry ran called Africa, I can't remember what it was called, but he ran it out of Harvard. And that was, at that time, a very elite establishment group that wouldn't begin to bring large numbers, plane loads of students from Africa to this country. I think it's made a difference. I don't know that I'd do it again. At the last book party that we had in Washington, the grandson of a airlift student from Tanzania, which was then Tanganyika, got up and said, now it's time to have an airlift in reverse and bring your students and your children to our countries to see them. And I think on that note, I will introduce Tom, who was found by Ted Keel to write this book. He wrote a book called Growing Up Maasai, which I read, and it showed a very deep appreciation for the Maasai Kenyan culture, and I thought that's just what we need for this book. Tom Shachtman.
Thank you, Cora. Cora has outlined what the African American Student Foundation did, and why they did it. I want to tell you a couple of stories that I think illustrate what this program was all about. This was a rather revolutionary program. At the time that it began, Kenya was a colony, and this was a tremendous problem for the United States State Department because they still had to deal with the British. They could not yet deal with Kenyatta and the next generation that was coming on. And this was a tremendous problem because the British wanted to control the education of the Africans in Kenya to the point where they would be practically unable to govern themselves when they came to be self-governing. This had been a tremendous problem over in Ghana, which had gotten its independence a few years earlier. They had to retain the entire white British civil service system because there was nobody to man the ministries. And Tom Mboya, who had been over in Ghana for their emancipation ceremony, shall we say, understood this very, very deeply. And he was a man who very much wanted to be educated, pretty much self-educated, and he realized that the essential thing for the next generation in Kenya was to be educated. If they weren't educated, there would be no democracy, there would be no nation. And so he set out to educate an entire generation of Kenyans and East Africans so that they would be there, so that he and his friend could take the ministerial position and that there would at least be somebody there to do the work of the sub-ministerial positions and to found clinics and found hospitals and found universities and so on. So I want to tell you about a couple of different meetings that took place that seem of relevance to me. One is, it takes place in New York after Tom Mboya's tour of the country of the United States in 1956. And one of the sponsors of that on the sidelines was this young airplane parts manufacturer and jazz enthusiast named Bill Scheinman. And he comes to Mboya's last stop on the lecture tour in New York, and he listens to this guy that he's been supporting, and he said, "That was an absolutely awful lecture. I really hated it. It must be a bad day." So he meets Tom backstage, and he says to Tom, "You're in New York. Have you ever been in Harlem?" And Tom says, "No." He says, "I'll take you there." Now, Bill Scheinman had been the publicist for the Count Basie Orchestra and had come at his understanding of how the world worked in part through alliances like that. So they go up to Harlem, they have dinner at a late hour, and they talk until 6 o'clock in the morning when Bill drives Tom to the plane at Idlewild Airport, and they go home, and a friendship was formed. This friendship consists of letters that start back and forth, tremendous correspondence, which is just now being opened to scholars at the Hoover Institution, and just a tremendous interchange between the two families from then on. They happen to be buried side by side on an island in Lake Victoria. So the second meeting is not really well credentialed in our book, but I know about it because of various things. And it's the meeting of two guys who used to go to the same school in western Kenya. This is in 1960, and the place that takes place is Central Missouri State College. And there's a second-year student there by the name of Frederick Okacha, and a first-year student that comes in, and his name is Perez Olindo. And he walks in the door, and he said, "Fred." And he said, "Perez." They had been classmates at a school in western Kenya. Now, these two guys were at a predominantly black college, the teachers' college, third-tier college, and they were there because they couldn't get in anywhere else, number one. Number two, nobody else would give them a scholarship. And number three, they didn't know where else to go because they're sitting over in Kenya. They have no idea. Can't get Lovejoys. I mean, there are only a couple of copies in the whole continent to tell them where to go to college. Anyway, these two fellows who started out there, who knew one another in high school, ended up being spectacular people. They went on to graduate schools. Perez became the first wildlife fellow at the University of Michigan and went on to head the national park in Kenya at an early age. Fred Okacha is a professor of psychology with a PhD from Yale, who founded university's psychology and departments and has done one of the most important studies of how people learn, contrasting the way that the Luo tribes people learn with the way that the British colonial system insisted that one should learn, to try and come up with an understanding of why very bright people like himself and Perez and so on simply couldn't make it up to the top levels of the British colonial educational system where they would be allowed to go to Oxford and Cambridge. That system was such a narrow, tapering pyramid that it was almost ridiculous. You have a country of 6 million people. That means there are a couple of million students, maybe 1 million people who are in high school at the most at that time, and about a dozen would be permitted to go to the British universities at that time. This is a very, very small percentage, and it's such a small percentage that it's ipso facto discriminatory. It cannot possibly allow a class of an educated elite to grow up in such a system. So what Tom Mboya and his friend, who, by the way, were all American educated, said is, we want to send people to the United States. We can send lots of them. At first, they just sort of hit on Bill Scheinman, and he was sending them one by two, here, have a ticket for this fellow or have a ticket for that fellow. And finally, Bill said, look, why don't we charter a plane? It's a little less costly for me. And my accountant says I need to have a foundation to do this. So do you think you can find 81 people to get on a plane? And they sure did. And they're quite wonderful, and a lot of their stories are in the book that we've been able to trace them through our letter writing and our internet and our friends in Kenya. And the next year after that, and that was the year, by the way, in which Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, and Jackie Robinson, 3 gentlemen who had never agreed on anything before in their lives, co-signed a letter saying, won't you please give us some money so that we can get our $30,000 or $40,000 to bring these young men and women to the United States. They've gotten their own scholarships. They've each come up with $300 in American currency in order to be allowed in the country. This is at a time when the Kenyan average national income is $58 a year. So you can imagine what a sacrifice it is to come up with $300. And they're willing to work, and they're willing to go to third-tier colleges if necessary in order to get here to do that. I can't tell you, I've yet to sit down and calculate it, the number of PhDs and MDs and final degrees that have come out of this group of people, many of whom started at small colleges. The press in 1959 could not get over the idea that 7 of these young men and women were going to Philander Smith College in Little Rock, Arkansas, 2 years after the Little Rock 9 and all of that. They were just astonished. How could you do? Why do you want to go there? And one of the fellows says, well, I think the experience might actually be relevant when I get back home. Because he was going to have to deal with equal discrimination when he got home, and he knew it. So of those 7, Cora and Tom helped a couple transfer up to Fairleigh Dickinson, and a lot of the others eventually transferred out. Very few of them stayed very long there. It was a tough environment, not a very good school. But these were spectacular students. Nobody had ever had more motivation than they did. I think I've just done something silly here with this, but I'll see if we can get it off. They were very good students, and the way we know that is they were able to transfer out and up consistently. To Yale, to Michigan, to the University of California, to many other schools, which were higher on the pecking order in the educational hierarchy, and they did very well there. They got on the dean's list. They went on to master's degrees, and doctorate degrees all through the United States and through Canada. We have many of their stories in there, and some of them are just majestic stories. The last meeting that I want to talk to you about is a meeting of Tom Mboya and Jack Kennedy. This takes place the week after Kennedy was selected as the 1960 Democratic nominee. And the program is at an impasse. The AASF has been able to raise $30,000 to $40,000 in the first year, but the next year they want to bring over 3 or 4 plane roads. That's 250 students, and they simply haven't got the cash from the individuals. So they have to go to foundation, and none of the foundations want to do this. Not Rockefeller, not Ford, not Carnegie, none of them. And they go through everything they can to try and get the State Department to kick in. State Department's rolling in money. They've got plenty of money there. Why don't you, Jackie Robinson says to Vice President Nixon, why don't you just take one of these C-5As that's sitting on the airstrip there, take it over and bring everybody over. Well, no, you'd have to put money in this budget. I mean, usual bureaucratic mess. And by the way, Vice President Nixon was trying very hard to have this happen. He, in the Republican Party, was the person who knew the most about Africa and was the biggest champion of Africa. We don't usually know that about Nixon, but he was. And his counterpart on the other side of the aisle was Senator Kennedy, who knew perhaps more about Africa than any other legislator there, including many of the African-American legislators who had, by and large, never been to Africa and had no intention of going there. So here we are, Frank Montero and Bill Scheinman and Cora, everybody decided the only way we're going to get something is if we bring Tom over for a conference in New York, and then he and Bill will go up to Hyannisport and see if they can twist Jack Kennedy's arm. Tom Mboya and Jack Kennedy knew one another slightly. They'd met at functions in the United States over the past several years once. And, they'd gotten along, and they had very similar things. And I have some passages in the book which are written for Kennedy or by Kennedy, we don't know which, but which seem to be almost exactly the kinds of wording and ways of looking at things having to do with education in Africa that Tom Mboya was saying. So there was a potential meeting of the minds. So they get an appointment, and they fly up to Hyannisport, and they have a meeting. And Jack Kennedy says to Bill Scheinman, so what's the drill? Why don't they like you? Bill said, we send unqualified students to unqualified colleges. And then he proceeded to explain why this was actually not so, but I just loved the way he phrased that. And so the three of them have a meeting, and then the two of them have a meeting, Kennedy and Mboya, and they're sitting there and talking for an hour about Africa, everything about Africa. And finally, after an hour, Kennedy says, I have to go see my back doctor. So the back doctor comes, and he does it. And he comes back, and he said, all right, what are you here for? And Tom says, we need money for this airlift. He said, well, I'll give you $5,000. And then a few minutes later, they keep talking. He said, well, I'll give you $5,000. We'll put Sarge Shriver on it. He'll canvass the other foundation. They'll come in because we're going to come in, and you'll be set. So then he says it 2 times more, and after the meeting, Scheinman says, Mboya says, hey, we got $15,000. And Scheinman says, what do you mean? He said, well, he said $5,000 3 times. So long story short, they did not get the money from anybody else. Sarge Shriver canvassed all of the other foundations, and they said, maybe next year. And so the Kennedy Foundation decided that they would go the whole hog and chip in. And it was $100,000 and enabled the airlift to float through the 1960 year and to bring over 250 people, which was wonderful. And then in the succeeding years, the program slowly got transferred over into the State Department and the mainstream. But it managed to change the way that business is done dealing with foreign students, especially from Africa. And number one, that means that the people who are at the seat of where this is happening get to choose who it is that's come, because they're the ones who know the student better than anyone else. Regardless of what the admissions requirements are at the Ivy schools or anywhere else, you still need to have someone on site who knows the students or knows where the students came from in order to pick them. Number two, these students, many of them had gotten their own scholarships, which is to say, we're not only giving you State Department scholarships. If you have the guts and the gumption and the stick-to-itiveness to go and find and obtain your own scholarship, we will help you get over there, because that's the major thing. You need help to getting over there. You take somebody like Barack Obama Sr., who got to University of Hawaii through a different route, but who then was supported in part from the foundation. And he gave a wonderful interview to local paper saying, well, it's a little more expensive here than I thought, so I'll just have to get a job. Never occurred to him in the world to sit back and wait for something to come in. That's the kind of student that got there. And by the way, at the other end of the pipeline, when Barack Obama Sr. got his PhD in economics, 6 other young men from Kenya also got their PhDs in economics from good universities, and all 7 of them went back to Kenya and worked for the various ministries of economics and interior and development and all of that. So the Obama Sr. story is not such a singular story. Obviously, we know that because the president came out of that everybody's paying attention to it, but the larger thing for me and in this book is that this was a whole generation of people that the generosity of the United States and the tenacity of Tom Mboya put together to make possible the country of Kenya as we know it today, and in some ways the countries of Tanzania and Uganda and others in the East Africa as well. At our gathering in New York to launch the book, the East African ambassadors came and as a tribute really to Cora, who works with them on a regular basis. And they all said one thing which I found tremendously interesting, which is that the westward tilt of their countries began with an understanding of how wonderful the airlift was, how selfless and how American. And I think that's about all I have to say. Thank you.
Tom brought photographs, and we can, let's see what's happening here. Okay. He brought photographs which I'm sure you would like to see. Also, if you have questions, we could entertain questions. I just want to say one thing. Cora didn't mention that she donated her material to...
May I go through the slides?
Yes, yes, okay. Let's see. Where is it?
Now that we've got this back on, I just take a few minutes of your time to take... Cora has many of the photographs out on the back benches here, and I hope you'll all look at them. But I'd like to narrate through this slideshow to begin with, give you some idea of this. We have no good music, so couldn't find the appropriate music, so there's none. This is Barack and his son at age 10 in the Chicago airport, waiting to get going. These 2 gentlemen I think that you recognize. This is a photograph that Harry Belafonte allowed us to use. This is the initial getting on the airplane in 1959. There were 5,000 people at the airport in Kenya, and the various people associated with it. This is all 81 of the students from the first airlift gathered in here. Here's Jackie Robinson in an uncharacteristically casual pose. He was there for many years. From left to right, we have Frank Montero, George Hauser, and Bill Scheinman. This is Bill working with one of the students at an early orientation. I'm not going to tell you who that is. This is Ted Keel up on the left here. when he was a good starker in the labor movement. This is Lorraine Hansberry, author of Raisin in the Sun at a teaching moment at the first classes. This is a young man named Simon Tuokero, who went back to become Kenyatta's private secretary. Here are some of the young men and women getting on the buses to be disposed to the colleges around the country. This is Jackie on the left, and the guy on the right, I forgot his name, but he later became president. On the right, you can hardly see her, is Mrs. Roosevelt. This is Adam Clayton Powell and Kennedy during the 1960 campaign.
The Hotel Teresa.
Unfortunately, they gave us a photograph. This is Kennedy and Mboya on the right, and Mboya's brother, Alphonse, on the left, during that 1960 meeting in Hyannisport. This is what I call the sniffing committee, when the Kennedy Foundation sent Ted Keel and a lot of others to Kenya to look over the situation before they really gave the money. The young gentleman with the pencil is called Malcolm X, who came to teach some of them. This young guy, I don't know who he is, but he's very tall. That's Frank on the left, being awarded a prize by the previous year's students. Similar one here. This is Eunice Shriver, who died last year, who was a big supporter of the organization in the second year. Here's one of the guys heading off to college. The students decided that they would give Senator Kennedy a prize stool. I'm sorry that got off this. This is Cora organized a reunion in 2007. And this is Pamela Mboya in the center, and her husband Peter on the right. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to give you a little sense of that, of some of the people who are involved with this. And we can now take questions you want to come up to.
Can you first finish what you were about to say? Yeah. Donated the collection.
I was saying that Cora donated her collection to the archives, the African Activists Archive at Michigan State University, and she could tell you more about that, but it's a fantastic donation, and I look forward to seeing it.
So do I. I want you to know there was one element that wasn't mentioned by either of us, and Jennifer Davis is here, who was the executive director of the American Committee on Africa, and it was the American Committee on Africa which started this whole thing in this country. I mean, they invited Tom Mboya to come and speak and so forth, and we worked very closely with the then executive director, George Hauser. And Amira Woods is here from the Institute for Policy Studies, who has been very helpful in promoting the book in the Washington area. And in the photographs in the back, you'll see Congressman Charles Diggs from Michigan. There are a number of photographs from the briefing session that we gave when the students arrived. We had them in New York for 2 or 3 days and tried to help them get a handle on understanding America. So Charlie Diggs is there, Lorraine Hansberry is there, Malcolm X is there, Ambassador, I'm going to block on names, and the former professor, Hugh Smythe and his wife, Smythe, they were both ambassadors to African countries. I can't remember her first name. Anyway, this is your time, not our time. No questions? No objections?
During this was a very interesting period of time in America. You know, I'm not from the United States. I'm also from the Caribbean, and you know, but during this period of time, obviously, this whole airlift took place against a very interesting Cold War era of competition, obviously, for Africa and for other parts of the world. And so I have 2 questions. I thought it was very interesting that he said that the airlift certainly helped and this whole entire education certainly helped to push, to move Africa into a more Western direction at a time when it was up in the air because of the internal problems that the United States was facing with racism at that time. was anybody during this time when this was happening, was this part of the discussion? I mean, were there, because, you know, a lot of, for example, ambassadors were coming here at that time to the United States of America, and here in Washington, D.C. and Maryland and different places, they were facing horrific racism, all type of problems, and this was leading to backlash in Africa. In this context, did this ever come up? Did this ever play out?
All the time. There's a photograph in the back of Oginga Odinga, who was the father of the present Prime Minister of Kenya, and who represented the Soviet wing of the Cold War, and Tom representing the American wing of the Cold War. And there was forever discussion and debate and clashes, but they did come together. Odinga did send some of his students on the airlift here. And in this country, the racism was horrific. I mean, there's a story, I think you've got the story in your book, about a kid who couldn't get a haircut and the ramifications of that.
I'd like to expand on it. We have a story in the book about a young man who came over to stay with a congregation up in Wisconsin, and they were crazy for him. But the nearby town had only one barber shop, and they'd never seen a black head of hair before. And the family was afraid that this young man would not be able to that he'd be thrown out of the chair or something like that. So they had to take him all the way into Minneapolis to get his hair cut. And I happened to tell this story at a gathering of some journalists, and found out that this was not a one-time incident, that there were a number of other people. Turned out the woman that I was talking to, her father had been dean at a Midwest college and had exactly the same situation occur there, and had done the same thing. He'd called up his barber and he said, "You are going to take this guy and you're going to give him good service, and you're not going to say a word, or else, you know, I'll hit you," or something like that. And so these were not isolated incidents. These were things that happened all of the time. And there was a wonderful phrase that we have in the book where Martin Luther King Jr. is exchanging correspondence with Tom Mboya. And at this time, as Roger Wilkins says in a paragraph on the back of our book, that African Americans in college in the United States were not identifying themselves with African or Africa at all. They had all of their own problems to deal with. When they found Africans on campus, this is what Roger said, they sort of turned their back around in the other direction. So there was no sense of solidarity between African Americans and Africans, except at the level of a guy like Martin Luther King Jr., who understood that anti-colonialism and the fight against segregation were the same fight. And this is what he said to Mboya. So that I think gives you some sense of the time in the idea that where Africa was and the thinking of African Americans at that time. That evolved very quickly over the next half dozen years. But in 1959, 1960, this was not the case at all. Was there another question?
Just let's add two pieces to that. There's a the saddest moment for me in the whole 4 years that I was working with this was when a darling guy who had worked his way up from a southern school to Lincoln University and was getting off a bus one day to walk back to campus and was run down by a car and killed, and I had to ship his body back to Kenya, and I maintained all the time that it was a racist murder, and the local police refused to investigate it. My husband, who's a lawyer, spent a lot of time with 3 kids who maintained that they were beaten up by New York City cops, which I believe, and Peter defended them and so forth. So there were constant, I mean, it's racism, it's America, it's the 50s and 60s, or the 21st century. I have a photograph of a Washington, D.C. journalist whom I do not remember, but I would love to have identified if any of you would like to look at it and see if you know who this is. Anyway.
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the British reaction to the
What?
the British reaction to the airlift.
To the airlift?
Oh.
Well,
Luke.
the best way that we can do that is to talk about what I call the smelling committee or sniffing committee that was sent over by the Kennedy Foundation in 1960. They were told by the British Minister of Education in Kenya, as well as in London, we don't like this program. And we don't like it because we're not in charge of it. And because we don't like the way they choose the students. Well, choosing the students was precisely the point of the program. You know, if you can't have your own people choosing the student, then it's chosen by a method that has nothing to do with who you are, where you came from, and where you're going to. And one of the most startling statistics, I think, is the number of graduates of this program who went back to Africa to work. Some of them not immediately, but almost all of them, I would say close to 90%, went back. And the average for foreign students in the United States is more like 30 or 40% go back. There's a huge majority of foreign students then and now come to the United States, find positions here, and stay here because they like it. In the earliest airlift, the 1959 airlift, one of the spokesmen answered a question from a media inquiry saying, we're not here for ourselves. We're not here by ourselves. We're here for our villages, we're here for our people, we're here for this and that. And we fully intend to go back. We hope there will be jobs for us because these guys will sponsor us, Mboya and his friends. But who knows, in 4 years, 5 years, what the facts are going to be. But that's our intention, and most of them eventually did. One of the more interesting ones managed in between going back to fill in an entire career at the City University of New York, coming out the other end as a tenured professor and then a retired professor, and then has simply transferred back to Nairobi and has continued work there with a whole new generation of children. So this is the kinds of people that were in the airlift and have continued to do this.
There's a specific story about a guy named Luke, who was the British Consul General in the United States at this period of history. And he claims that he did a survey of the airlift students in this country, and that they all were poverty-stricken and suffering and cold and not doing well in school. And he put this out. He made this public. This is in the book, yep. The Luke letter. And it was all baloney. I mean, I can't remember exactly whom he interviewed. You do. Okay. Tom will remember the fact. I have the letter here.
Fortunately, in the file that Mr. Keel gave to me is the Luke report. And I was able to go over it student by student and find out what the heck this guy was talking about. And he did do did history a service by going and visiting a lot of the students in their colleges in situ. Unfortunately, in gardening terms, he was pulling the carrot out of the ground before it was ripe. Almost all of the students, when they got to the United States, had a little problems at the first, because first of all, they didn't speak the language. You have to understand that English is at least the third language of most of the young men and women who came here. They had a tribal language, they had the Kenyan national language, and then they spoke English. So to speak American English is tough. Second of all, the method of instruction in the British colonial system was really very rigid and very tough, and absolutely did not leave any room for classroom discussion. So when they come here and say, hey, you, Jane, what do you think about that? You know, it's going to be a very difficult thing to come up with and do that. But after 2 or 3 semesters, they straightened out, and they also managed to straighten out their finances. They were indeed impoverished, but they were not starving, number one. Number two, they could call up Cora and say, please send me $50, and she always found a way to do that. I don't know how many. I would say maybe 1,000 requests of things like that, but many, many, many of them. Some for $25, some for $50.
It was from the African American Student Foundation.
Yes, but here is the administrator here, and the mother to whom all of these students applied, most of them successfully for grants and small things, and in general to be their connection with the outside world. So the Luke thing was quite wonderful. It played out in the pages of the New York Times. Very fun. Anybody? Any other questions? Okay.
Well, let's end this on an upper. One of the most remarkable things in going through the files that I have discovered is the quantity, the enormity of press that we received. Huge stories about Senator Scott attacking Kennedy on the floor in debates in the Senate. Huge editorial in the New York Times debunking us for being more crash than program. Letters to the editor, which were not limited to 75 words or 3 paragraphs in those days, but 2 columns, letter to the editor. One from Bill Scheinman refuting the New York Times editorial, one from me appealing for jobs and homestays for kids. So we didn't have the competition of everybody being glued to the screen or wired or Twittering. People read newspapers in those days. And the amount of press is extraordinary. I don't think anyone can do that today. It's just remarkable. And that had quite an impact, because when we sent out fundraising letters, we would get back literally thousands. To one letter, we got over 4,000 responses from pennies, $2, $3, $5, 1 larger, 2 larger. I mean, people, there was one letter from the Bronx post office where the postal workers went around to collect money, and they got $2 and $3 each from each postal worker sent in an envelope to our office. So it was a different time, and there was a great deal of love and feeling that it was important to support this, because it was not going to be just good for Africa. It was going to be good for America, too.
The question of impact. I worked in Nairobi in the middle 70s through the middle 90s. And as far as the impact is concerned, it was very rare to meet any Kenyan civil servant or minister who did not go through the program here, at least half. From the ministers, the permanent secretaries, the assistant secretaries, and especially the economic ministry.
Yeah.
Lay was the key person there.
Well, that's true. There were almost 800 kids who came through, men and women. Well, from Kenya, maybe, what, 600, 700. And now, many of those families are sending their children, and now their grandchildren. I mean, they're all my age, basically. We were all the same age. So they've got grandchildren ready to go to college.
I find this to be a fascinating story, and to know that the records were kept so that Tom and others can look and find stories and find relatives. I just think it's fascinating, fantastic, and phenomenal. We have the book for sale in the back, and so I hope that you will visit that stand. Also, we have a few other things. Cora spoke at the African Studies Association's annual meeting and gave a very good discussion. In fact, people were riveted to her. And so we have a clip of that we'll show you after the filming stops. And also, we could also look at the photographs that Tom showed a few minutes ago. And they're the photographs in the back. So this is a fantastic collection. It's a fantastic story, and it's very rewarding, and the impact is phenomenal. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.